the North, for a long time under British colonial rule, had benefited from some attention and resources. Many of the Acholi people were civil servants serving different functions in the government, and as a result had higher levels of living and education than other parts of the country, especially the South. Then when the power dynamics shifted and a new president came to power, there was a sense that the North had benefited so much that it was time now to sort of deal with what they called the Northern question and balance the power back towards the South. And it was after that attempt that the Lord's Resistance Army began its movement as a way of trying to reclaim their access to power, to land, to resources, which was really being taken away from them. Then, of course, horrible atrocities were committed by the Lord's Resistance Army, but also by the government of Uganda in the way it responded to this conflict. So it's too easy to put it as an ethnic conflict. It's really about access to resources and power in a state that's really still struggling, I think, to find its way in the aftermath of colonialism. And one of the most horrible outcomes of this conflict, to which we see enduring consequences today, is the way in which women and children were affected. So the Lord's Resistance Army had a strategy of abducting young children to join its forces for a few different reasons, both because I think they were more easily influential and malleable, and secondly, there was also this idea of starting young and creating a new Acholi people. So young girls, as young as 8, 10 years old, were abducted, and that's the story of the two women, Janet and Angela. They were abducted, I think, between 8 and 10 years old each. Were abducted and forced to join the Lord's Resistance Army. And this is one thing that the government was unable to stop those abductions, and that's one of the key complaints they have now, that the government has a responsibility. Should have protected them at the time, it didn't, and so now it needs to make right the violations they suffered as a result. So these young girls were abducted into the Lord's Resistance Army, and in that they played a variety of roles, and it's actually quite complicated, the structures in which they fell into, and that's also something that's often not understood. Often when they were very young, they would start out as babysitters, so caring for other older women's children or older girls' children. So making them food, changing their diapers, carrying them when they were moving, looking out for them during battles. And then often, once these girls hit puberty, they were then assigned to different commanders as wives, as bushwives is the way they're known. And this was something, there was no choice over the matter. It was, again, part of the project of the LRA to create a new population of pure Acholi people. So there was emphasis on encouraging and forcing both men and women to marry. So I think also what's important to note, it's not just the women that were forced into marriages, the men themselves were. So sometimes you had a union between a 16-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl. And maybe that 16-year-old boy was a commander, but he was still being forced into this system. Some of the girls were also offered up to the higher-ranking commanders, and there often the age gap was much different. And some of the women that we've spoken to comment on the challenges they faced. So they were made to be forced wives, but also still to serve as soldiers. So they had to do everything. They had to learn to use a gun, sometimes to fight in battle. They had to take care of their bush husbands, so serve him meals, prepare water for washing, and then take care of the kids, so giving birth to kids in very difficult situations, sometimes in the battlefield with no medical support, and then having to run for their lives right afterwards. And oftentimes there was no food, no water, diseases, extremely difficult conditions. Then the story that's less told, that's less talked about, is also what happened to women at the hands of the government. The UPDF, the United People's Defense Forces of Uganda, so the government military forces, are also known to have committed rape both inside the camps where the civilians were living and at random occurrences. So, and there was a lot of, obviously, shame and stigma associated with this, so it's something that's not talked about. and nothing's been done for these women or for the children born as a result. The government programs offered very minimal support. It was mainly a certificate saying they were granted immunity from criminal prosecution. They were not going to be held criminally accountable for any of their acts committed within the Lord's Resistance Army. And then they were given maybe 200,000 shillings, which is $200 or so, a bag of rice, and maybe a mattress, nothing else. So there were then the NGO community came in to also support the reintegration efforts of these formerly abducted children. And several centers were set up, especially in Gulu, where people could stay for several months as they received medical treatment, because a lot of them had health issues because of the really harsh conditions of life in the bush. They also received psychosocial support, some skills training, and then at different moments, once either the resources ran out or they were deemed ready to go, they would then be returned to their community. And what those programs failed to see is the way in which the community was going to be ready or not to receive them. And several people commented on, while there was work done on the individual, not enough work was done for the receiving community to think about, were they ready to receive these children or not? And so in some cases, the civilian population who was receiving them saw them as perpetrators, as killers, as the cause of all their suffering, even if that individual child hadn't been personally responsible. And what we see now, and from our work just this year, is that even though it's years since the worst of the conflict has passed, there's relative peace in northern Uganda. The animosity, the sentiment of revenge and culpability assigned to these young mothers who were abducted as children, and then their children that they bore as a result of the forced marriage within the rebel group. No consideration was given to the children born of these children. So many of the cases, they were child mothers who came back sometimes 18 years old with 2 kids. And so the focus was on that child, the mother, but not on what she would do with her children. It was really striking when we went in April to 4 different parts of northern Uganda. In every place, we heard repeatedly one of the biggest challenges was stigma. And that's something that you hear talked about in the literature, how to overcome stigma. But what we found is, actually, I think stigma is not an accurate characterization of what's actually happening. What's happening is a complete and outright rejection of these mothers and their children. And as a result, they are unable to pursue a life of dignity. And for the children, in many cases, there's almost just no chance for them to succeed. Even though the Constitution of Uganda is very progressive and clear on equality between men and women, and outlaws any discrimination against women in terms of access to resources, what you see in reality and practice is that's completely ignored. So for these young women who come back with children, they face a huge challenge in accessing basic resources. So first, a plot of land to live upon, and then, as I say, in northern Uganda, it's a very primarily agricultural-based society. So one of the main forms of income generation is farming. And having access to land is really a guarantee of an investment that you really need in order to be able to do anything in the future. And in the present, everything is passed down through the father. Identity, access to land, access to resources. So a young girl has no right to any property until she marries. She gets it from her husband. A son has access to property through his father, and then when he marries, he goes and lives on his father's land. And that's the way it's always been done, and continues to be done today. The stepfathers are one of the biggest challenges for these children born of conflict-related sexual violence, that they make their lives miserable. They will provide food for their own biological children while excluding the children that the mother had previously. They will pay school fees for their own children, but not for the ones who came previously. If the mother's around, sometimes she can defend her own children, but she's also caught in a very tough position of trying to have at least some shelter and provide something for herself and her kids, and then struggling to protect the rights of her children that she came back with from the bush. And if that woman happens to have a son, it poses even greater difficulty because, again, the son is supposed to inherit land from the father. So if she doesn't know the father's family and is not in touch with the father's clan, there's a fear among her relatives that her son will then try and take their land. In northern Uganda, it's an overall context of poverty and lack of infrastructure and lack of resources. So oftentimes people will say, well, why focus on these children who were born in captivity or these children born of conflict-related sexual violence when so many others are suffering? And it's true that there is a great need for more investment in northern Uganda. However, the children who have been born of rebel fathers or born out of rape of the government soldiers face an additional obstacle, which is the rejection, because they're a child of another, and they don't have the benefit of a paternal clan that will provide for them some basic resources. Yet in many cases, they have the looming shadow of their father's identity as a rebel or as a soldier, which is putting further obstacles in the way of them finding other resources. And so there's a sense that, again, they're held accountable for the sins of their fathers in a certain way. One thing that really struck us when we went and spoke with mothers, their children born of sexual violence related to the conflict, the teachers, community members, was the extent to which the rejection based on this past role association with the conflict doesn't get better with time. It actually, in some ways, gets worse and gets passed down from the mother who was abducted as a child, came back with children. So her child, born in captivity, faces that rejection. And then in some cases, too many cases, these young children then become young mothers themselves, and their children already face the stigmatization and are also rejected. And what I think over the long run, if the government of Uganda is committed to redeveloping and revitalizing northern Uganda, it cannot ignore this key segment of the population whose rights have been violated and who as a result now are prohibited from being productive members of society. They want to, they're working so hard, but they're not given the opportunities, the access to do so. The two main groups that we worked with are Watiki Gen and the Women's Advocacy Network. Both of these groups are composed of all women who were abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army at a young age as children. And it's actually a miracle. They say themselves, it's a miracle that they work together as a group, because a huge strategy that was used within the Lord's Resistance Army was to pit the different wives against each other. So high-ranking commanders would have first wife, second wife, third wife, up to 40 wives sometimes. You know, if you were first wife, you had more privileges and you would order around the second wife. She sort of became your servant. And as a result, the women never were able to work together, for example, to plot escape. And that was deliberately done by the commanders. So the fact that these women returned to Gulu with their different ranks and maybe their different tensions from their time in the rebel group, and now are working together to support each other, to listen to each other, and to advocate for their rights, is in itself a miracle. Adding to that the fact that they were taken away from their families at a very young age, deprived of education, saw horrible atrocities committed in front of their eyes, and now, again, are fluent in multiple languages and able to mobilize and speak and advocate for others who have perhaps less of a voice than they do. It's important not to view these women as victims. They're not. They're empowered. They have a strong sense of themselves. They have coped through so much and have a resilience that keeps them going despite their challenges. And a lot of that they find within supporting themselves, because they understand what it was like, and it's something that no one else can really relate to. For these women and their children born as a result of conflict-related sexual violence, as a first step, I think it's really important to recognize the severity of the problem, to acknowledge that they are facing rejection to such an extreme level that it's preventing them from living their lives. And with that recognition of the problem, the government of Uganda needs to apologize to them, needs to acknowledge that their rights were violated, needs to recognize that they failed to protect their citizens and keep them out of harm's way. And now, with that recognition, I think that would go a long way also to helping at the level of the community to, in a sense, de-vilify these women and their children. If the government of Uganda steps up to the plate and says, actually, we had a responsibility here and we failed in our duty, it could take some of the burden off the women and the children. Right now that hasn't happened, and no one is taking responsibility. No one's really explained the conflict, why it happened, and how and why. And as a result, people are making their own stories up and blaming the person closest to them, those most vulnerable with the least amount of support and resources. So after the government of Uganda acknowledges and apologizes to the women, then to make that meaningful, it needs to be followed by concrete action. That's where reparations come in and redress. And there it really needs to involve a careful examination of what are the challenges they're facing as a result of the violation they suffered, what are the enduring consequences that are affecting them and their children, and what steps can be taken to remedy those. It's not a case of pity, it's not a case of charity, it's an issue of rights and redressing rights that were violated. If you pay the school fees but the school's not an environment that welcomes them, it won't get you any further. So there also needs to be a national discussion, a national reckoning with this past, and some form of dialogue or historical clarification that allows people to then move forward from it, understand each person's victimization and not put their victimization above those of others. Also at the local level, it's really important for local officials they're the ones distributing the funds and making sure it reaches the target population. There's a lot of corruption and diversion of funds that's a problem throughout the country. So trying to put in place mechanisms to ensure that the beneficiaries of women and children actually receive what they're due. There's also, I think, a role for community leaders, religious leaders, cultural leaders, to try and have some dialogues about the way in which these women and children are treated. And I think also as an international community, there's a responsibility to be aware of this problem in northern Uganda and think of steps that can be taken either through donors that are supporting the government of Uganda to make them actually take responsibility and provide redress to these victims, of other local international NGOs working in the community. And I think it's also really important to note that this is not a problem specific to northern Uganda. This is unfortunately a problem that has occurred in the past, starting post-World War II, with children born of German soldiers in occupied territories, in the former Yugoslavia, and in many other contexts. And currently we see this issue in Colombia. This will be an issue with the peace process moving forward. There'll be a need to think about what were the patterns of conflict-related sexual violence, what children were born as a result, how will the community be prepared to receive them or not, and then what steps are taken. So there's not one answer, but what needs to sort of really be clearly communicated is that sexual violence doesn't just happen in a void and doesn't just end with that act. In many cases, it yields a child, and what happens to that child? And it's not enough to just try and prosecute the crime of rape or hold the perpetrator accountable. There also needs to be measures put in place for the mother and also, very importantly, for the child. And up to now, that hasn't happened. They've been forgotten.